Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in this video what I want to do is kind of show you guys the benefits of using things like React Recoil for state management and React Query for doing your API requests, and kind of how to use them in sort of a very sort of dry, really simplify your components kind of way. So first thing we need to do is create a new React app. Just show you like a standard counter and a standard API request just using this normal React patterns. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is just create a new React app. So I'll just do an npx create React app, and we'll just call this Recoil Query because I'm going to be using those two libraries. So that's going to install there. But essentially, while that installs, just explain what these two libraries are. React Recoil is like Facebook's answer to like Redux, XState, MobX. So basically it was React, and then everyone kind of came out with their own different like state management libraries, Redux, XState, MobX, etc. And basically Facebook said, you know, we'll make one too, and it will be awesome. And it is awesome. It is called Recoil. And React Query answers like the age-old issue of like making API calls, and what happens with like API calls if you need the same data in multiple components, then you have to kind of worry about passing that state around or making the same API call multiple times when you really only needed the data once. And basically what React Query does, it helps manage that sort of cache where you can sit there and say, hey, there's this query that I'm making, and don't make it again unless I decide to refetch it. And even if I pull this data from inside of another component, instead of you having this unique state in each component, and that's kind of the theme with both of these libraries, instead of you having you're lending on context in React, and you're leaning on context, you're leaning on shared state. And this is great for data that is shared between components. Again, bottom line is if the data that is going to be stored in your state is really only needed in that component, then you just use state like you've always had. The reasons you would use Recoil React Query is because you have data that you need multiple components, or you want shared between multiple instances of that component. So you don't want it to necessarily be unique to the instance, as another reason why you may want to do that. Okay, so now that that's finished setting up, I'm going to open up the terminal. Okay, and I'm going to just do a npm start for now. So again, before I install anything, actually I got to cd into the actual folder, cd into Recoil Query, npm start. First thing I want to do is just kind of, again, just set up the standard, React counter, standard sort of like just API call. Okay. So what I'm going to do is in this source folder, I'm going to make two components folder like you would normally see, and then I'm going to make a counter component. So we'll call it counter.js. And I mean, you've seen counter components probably thousands of times. I'm going to import use state from React. You've seen this 1,000 times before. Function, counter, won't take any props right now. Okay, and essentially what we do is usually you would declare like some state, so it's say const counter set counter equals use state, and we'll say the state starts at 0. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Okay, and then what we would do is we would return some JSX, so we'll return a div. Inside this div there's an h1. Okay, and the h1 basically is just going to show us the counter, and we'll have a button that when you click on it will add one to the counter. So basically we'll pass in a function that just makes a call to set counter, which will equal counter plus 1. Okay, cool. And then that's your typical counter. So we have this component, let's export it, export default counter. Okay, let me just save it so that we prettier can just make it nice and pretty. Okay, and basically I go to app.js, I'm going to go import counter, I'm going to just pretty much bop out this whole bit of JSX, replace it with just a div, with counter inside of it. Okay, so now we have the counter. See, I can click on this and it adds one to its state. Control C. Okay, and see, these both have their own individual state. Okay, and that's fine if that's what your intention is to create a counter where every time you use that counter, it is its own counter. It starts from scratch. Then this is perfect. But what if you have a counter you plan on using multiple places throughout your app, but you want them to all share the same count? Okay, so then you want them to have a shared state. So this is where like state management comes in. This is where you kind of want, you could, lift the state and pass it as props. That gets a little convoluted though sometimes. So using something like Recoil can really kind of fix that. So I'm going to shut off the server for a moment, and I'm going to install Recoil. npm install Recoil. Okay, so that's going to install Recoil. It's going to take a second. Taking a little longer than I expected, but it just finished. Good. Okay, so now the setup Recoil, it's at the end of the day, like all these kind of state management kind of libraries, they all revolve around React context. Like that's the mechanism they use to kind of share state. So in that case, kind of like React Router, what we want to do is in the index.js is just kind of wrap our app component in that provider. So what I would do is I would just say import, I'll use curly brackets here, from Recoil. Okay, and then what I want to import is the Recoil provider, I think it's called. Recoil maybe it's not that. Let's take a look. Worst comes to worst, I have to go look it up. Recoil bridge, Recoil root, that's what I want. Okay, there we go. The Recoil root. Okay, so we're going to wrap the Recoil root around everything. Like so. Okay, and this again is essentially a context provider, and that's essentially really where all that shared state is being stored. Okay, so that's pretty easy, straightforward. Now what we have to do is we have to declare these sort of shared pieces of state. The way I like to do it is I generally will create a file in my source called atom.js, because each individual piece of state is referred to as an atom. So what I'll do is I'll just import atom from Recoil. Okay, so we import atom from Recoil, and then what you do is you say const atom, we'll say, what's the name? We'll call this atom the counter state, and we'll just say equals atom. Okay, and it takes in an object. Okay, and this object has many keys. I think the first one is called just key. Okay, and this is gonna be it's just a string for it to internally keep track of like which variable this belongs to. So what's gonna happen is that whenever I try to pull this counter state under the hood, there's an object. It's gonna use this key to see, does this already exist inside our state? And if it doesn't exist in our state, it'll initiate it using a default value. Okay, and so that's what default's gonna be. So technically we would want to start the count at 0. Okay, so those are the two properties, and there we go. We have atom. Now, right now what we're going to do is export it. Okay, so I'm going to show you one way, just a straight up Recoil way of doing this. So that's it. That's a shared state. Now I can go use that state in any component that I want. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using this use state hook, I'm going to use import use Recoil. Let's see if I can just do it this way. Import use Recoil state. Yeah, so that's what I want. Use Recoil state from Recoil. Okay, and then I also need to import the atom, so I need to import counter state. Okay, so this line stays the same. I can keep this like const counter set counter. So that's the nice thing about Recoil, is like you don't really have to change the way you set things up. The only difference, instead of using use state, I'm going to use Recoil state and then pass in the counter state. Okay, And now what happens if I well, let me turn on the server, npm start. Instead of each of them having sort of their own independent count that relies on each time the component lies, now they're sharing the state. So now when I click on one, it changes both of them. So again, imagine that like different parts of your app, you want to use the same counter component, but you're always going to be pulling from the same sort of source of data. This is kind of like a really easy way to set it up. I mean, the other way you could have set it up again is you could have it take a prop, and then you just have to make sure you pass in that prop and make sure that that counter is somewhere higher in the component tree, and you're passing it down. But this is actually, look, that's pretty straightforward. So you can imagine this for things like, imagine like a like button. Again, this is like Facebook, who created React and Recoil. So imagine like a like button, the same like button for the same piece of content should have like the same count regardless of where it is in the app. So in this case, you could have that sort of component pulling from the same data every time. Okay, not that they're saving the whole database of likes in memory, but this is an illustrative point. Okay, so that's neat. Okay, we're able to pull that same data, and again, if there's other components that rely on that same data, they'll all be in sync with each other because we're all pulling it from Recoil. But the nice thing about using Recoil versus things like Redux is that, one, it's really easy to set up. As you saw, that wasn't that hard to set up, and like the way it looks pretty much like you're using useState. So you're not changing the way you do things all that much. You can still just keep kind of thinking in that same React mold without sort of that sometimes kind of overwhelming shift to using like a reducer and then having to make everything like a case or an if statement, and think about like centralizing all your logic over here and then having to pass in like the right action. You just say, okay, I have an atom, it represents some data that I want, and it stays in sync. And the cool thing is you can use custom hooks. What I like to do is use custom hooks to make this even more straightforward. Okay, so what I would do is I would go back to that atom file, and then for each atom I create, instead of exporting the atom, depending on what you're trying to do, I would just create a hook. So instead I would export a hook, and I would just say like export const use counter state. Okay, and that's going to be equal. And then what I would do is I would import use recoil state here. So now I can do this, use recoil state. Well, this is going to be a function. And the function just returns the same thing that use recoil state passing the counter state returns. Okay, so now in this case, this function already has this piece. So I don't have, now if I go back to counter, having this hook being exported, this custom hook, I don't necessarily need to do both of these imports. I could replace both of these imports and just replace it with use counter state. Okay, and then instead here, I don't have to pass an argument. I can just say use use counter state, and that's it. Okay, now, and again, when I'm passing it in multiple components, what's nice about that is I don't have to, again, I'm not importing two things every time I want to use it in a particular component. Okay, refresh, and it still works the same. Again, using custom hooks to kind of really reduce the code in my file. And now this counter component reads very, very clean. Okay, right? Counter set counter looks just like I'm setting state, except I'm using this custom hook. And it works, and it's synced between multiple instances. And again, that counter state would stay in sync with any component that I use it in. And that's just, again, very convenient. Okay, so that's great for like non-API data. Okay, but how about when it comes to API calls? This is where we might want to use a React query. So first, let's just show you like a component without React query. So we say new file. And basically, we're going to call this request.js. Okay, in this file, what I want to do is create a component. Now, typically, if we wanted to do an API call without using the library, we would do something like this. So we'd say import, again, I'm going to import useState, so I'll just do this, useState. Okay, so there's useState. And then I'm going to create the function, request. Again, no props, don't need any props. And I would do something like this. First I would create some state, so it would be like const, and actually I'm going to need use state for this too. So you see like this is going to end up looking a little chunky. Okay, so const first the state, so we'll say const response set response. Okay, just to keep it simple. Okay, response set response, and I would say use state, and I would initiate it as, depending on what the data that I expect back is, I'm going to use JSON placeholder, which returns me an object. So I'll initiate it as an empty object. Let me just go get that URL. Okay, then what I would do is I would then write a function to actually fetch the data. So I would say like const get response equals, and I would write an async function using fetch or Axios. Async function, and I would say, let me just go grab the URL here. Boop. Okay, and I would just say, okay, const r for response equals await fetch the URL, and then const data equals await r.json. That's, so basically we're making the fetch, we're getting the data, we're getting the response object, and we want the data as a JavaScript object, so we run the JSON method in that response object that turns it into a nice JavaScript object we can use. Okay, and that's what I want. Okay, and then yeah, that's that. Okay, then what I would do is I would do set response to data, and that would set the response to data. Wonderful. And again, just to kind of demonstrate what data is currently, we'll say console.log response. But the thing is that I have to call this function. I'd like to call the function when the component loads, but I don't want to create like an infinite loop, because I set the state that updates the component, which then runs the function again, and that updates the state, then creates this sort of infinite loop. So typically what we would do is we would do a use effect. And then in the use effect, we would pass a function and an empty array, because we only want it to happen once. Okay, and then we would just call get response in here. Okay, and again, we have to return some JSX, so I'll just say return h1 request. Okay. Cool. So there's like the component in a nutshell. Then let's export default the component. Export default request. Okay, and let me just hit save. Okay, and so you have this, and this is fine. Well, we have use state imported twice, so let's fix that. Okay, so if I go back to the app here, okay, let me actually import this into app. So import, what's the one I'm looking for? Request. There we go. And then I'll use this request component. Okay, and then let me just open up DevTools so we can see the console log. And we can see, like, look, right now it's calling twice. It's making like basically two calls because, or we see two console logs actually. We see one console log because the initial render, we don't have the data yet. So you see like this data is just empty. Okay. And then on the second call after the state's updated, the component re-renders and we have the data from the API. Now, if I make two of these components and I put them both on the screen, see now I'm seeing multiple calls. So let me just refresh the page. Okay, and you see like the first is two empties and then two fulls. And if I go to the network, I'm seeing that there's two API calls. Okay, I only really want to make one API call because it only is going to happen once. And then I get the data. Cool. Now, let's see what happens when we add React query. So I do an npm install React query. Okay, and that's going to eventually, yep, there we go. Okay, React query. So now we have to set up React query, which is going to be very similar to setting up like before. So we have to head back to index.js, set up the context provider for React query. So I'm going to say import from React query, and there's going to be one that's called like query provider, I'm pretty sure. Query. Here we go, query client provider. And then there's also query client. I think there's a lowercase one too. Let me just double check here. No, it's just query client. Okay. So we need to get those two there. And what you need to do is create a new client. So you say const query client equals query client. So you just do that. Okay. And then we have to wrap this in the client provider. So query client provider. Okay, I think I made too many copies there. So just delete that one, cut this one, and wrap all of this in there. So again, it's just kind of wrapped again. You know, then if I did React Router, I'd have to wrap another one. So you can just see like I'm just wrapping all these context providers. Query client provider. And there, React query setup. So it's two steps. You create a new query client, and then actually here we have to pass in a prop client, and client requires us to pass in the query client. There we go. So now we're all set up. Okay. But it's all about sending that context provider, and now we can use React query. So let me refactor this using React query. Okay, so instead of using useEffect and useState, I'm going to use useQuery. Okay, a hook from React query, and it basically would look like this. So I would delete this line. I don't need this anymore. Okay, and I don't need the useEffect anymore. Instead, I'd still declare the function. That's still going to be useful. Okay, what I would do is I would say const response equals use query, and then we're going to give the query a name, so we'll just call it like JSON P for JSON placeholder. So that's going to be the key, so that way it knows like, is this a request I've made before or not? Because essentially it's kind of doing what Adam did, where it has like a key for everything it's doing, so that way it knows like, does this thing exist already? And where Adam said, hey, if this thing doesn't exist, I'll just set it to its default value. In query, it's saying, okay, if this thing doesn't already exist, I'm going to run this function that we pass in next, which will be our getResponse function. Although, one minor change. This getResponse function needs to return a promise. So really what I want to do instead is return data. Okay, and then that fixes it. Now this function returns a promise, because async functions always return a promise. Okay, that's why it's nice to do an async function, because then you're guaranteed to return a promise, because it's just how they work. So basically, again, what happens is going to check, has this query been done anywhere before? If so, it's going to use the cached data. So if I use the same key in another file, in another component, I'm not necessarily making the same request again. Okay, and then if it does need to make the request, it's going to run this function, and then the data that that gets stored in the response will be based on the promise that this function returns. And yeah, that should be it. It should be working now. So if I do npm start, it should be working as it was. Cannot set property defined. Let me see here. Okay, I might have set something up wrong, so let's just double check. So let's just look up React query. Get started. Okay, so we did set up the query client. We did all that. Good. And then use query, put in the string and the function. Okay. So that looks like it as it should. Okay, so let's see here. Where are we going wrong? What doesn't it not like? Config, cannot set property query cache. So I'm going to modify this so that way we just, instead of returning the data, I'm just going to return the response, return r.json. Because I think the issue is the awaiting. Yep, that seems to be the case. Nope, no, it's not. Return r.json. These aren't the best errors. Let's see, this dot query cache equals config dot query cache. Let me just check one thing. Let's see here, when they created the query client, I didn't need to use the new keyword. That's where I made a mistake. So let me undo this, because I always like to do controlled experiments. Change one thing at a time to see what fixes it. But it looks like what I need to do is here, this is actually a constructor, and I just slipped my mind, and I forgot the new keyword. Okay, and does that get us where we want to be? And it does. Okay, so let's take a look at our console logs. So now I'm getting 4 console logs. Well, before, which is still what I kind of got before, but let's just see what happens when I have one of these, just to kind of illustrate like the behavior. So if I look at this, see I'm getting this response object each time. Okay, but if I take a look at the first one, see there's no data. That's fine, that's to be expected. And that's just because the console logs are still in both components. So I'm really getting console log twice. But it's really only making the API call once. Because if I go to sources, if actually we go to the network here and I refresh, notice instead of seeing 2 of these requests, now we only see 1. Okay, and we're getting the data back. So if I go to my React Dev Tools, and let's take a look at these request components, and take a look at the query hook. Okay, ref true, state, query client. I will eventually find what we're looking for. Current query. It's in there somewhere. Okay, but the data is there. Okay. Okay, maybe it's in here. See, query doesn't. Well, you get back in the response object. So, like again, what you get back is this response object instead, and this is kind of organized for you. So if I go back to the last 2, which should be you can see the status. So it was loading when it made the API call, and then it went to success. Okay, and now you have the data under this data property, and you have a lot of different cool things you can use. Like refetch is a function to remake the API call if you need to make it again, and these are a bunch of like state properties to determine like sort of what the situation is in. So like you can use like is error, is fetch, all these little like booleans to keep track of what you want to return. So just to show you like how I can use that, what you typically would do is instead of using response, instead of saving it in this variable called response, you're going to destructure what you need. I don't need the whole response object. I really just want data or really I want data, error, is loading, and refetch. Okay, those are going to be typically what you're going to want. Okay, and then you can set up some sort of conditional logic to return different JSX. Okay. Okay. So you could do something like this. Okay. Import, let's say if error, then we return h1 error. If is loading, okay, so if loading is true, we would return loading. And then if those 2 don't happen, then you'll just return request. We'll just leave that. We don't have to make a separate if statement because only if the previous if statements are true, only if they're both false would we ever get to this line of code. Okay, so I don't need to bother with like an else or anything like that. It'll just be like, is this true? No. Is this true? No. Okay, fine. We should have the data now. Let me go use it. Okay, and in this case, what I'll do is I'm going to just iterate over the object. So we can see all of its properties. So how would I do that? I would just create a div. And we're going to say, because I know that the source of this data, like what we get back is an object. So what I can do is I can just do this. I will say, we'll create a UL. And then what we'll do is we'll do object.keys data, because that's going to give us a array of strings. And again, I used the wrong symbol over here. Okay, object.keys data. It's going to be an array of the keys, and then I'm going to map over that. And then for each key, what I want to return is an li, where in the li we're going to have the key colon data the key. Okay, and it doesn't quite like that at the moment. Let's think about why. What is it saying? Unterminated regular expression. That means I left something open. Oh, I never finished this. There we go. Okay, good. Okay, you can see I got the data back. Okay, so you see I got the data back, and I looped over it and printed out all of its properties. Now if I refresh the page, you see it says loading for like a second, because at some point this Boolean is loading is there. So the nice thing is that it kind of gives you all that, and then if I wanted to like refetch it, I could create a button to refetch it. I could say button, and then do like a on click equals, refetch, and then that'll just refetch it. So refetch. Okay, and again, the beauty is these are both not making their own API calls. The API call is only going to happen once for both. So I'm using that same data. And if I use the same query with that same key in multiple components, I'm not making that same API call over and over and over and over again. It actually will cache the data and share it among all those instances, and only update it when I decide to run this refetch function, which will then redo it. And that's very nice because it makes it a lot easier to manage that data. Okay, so what am I looking to do again? Okay, yep, it's complaining about the key prop, but that's fine for now. But if I go to like network, okay, again, I refresh the page, so you only see one API call. And then if I click refetch, I only see one API call. But again, they're sharing that data. Both of them will update if there's a change in the data. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Okay, and you can make this really interesting. You can make it like, you can make this get response function more dynamic, that it depends on some other data, so that when you refetch, it might pull like different data, and that could be something from Atom. All sorts of cool stuff. But kind of like we did with React Recoil, this all gets a little muddy, and we would like to simplify this a little bit. So once again, hooks, custom hooks to the rescue. Okay, so what I would do is create a new file, and we'll call it like queries.js. And what I would do is I would copy, we'll create a new hook. So let me go back to that queries file real quick. Well, I'll just click over here. Queries. There we go. And then I'm going to want to use query here. And then what I would do is I would go back to that component. Let me just close all this stuff, make this a little bit easier to work around. So back to my components, I'm going to grab that request, and I'm going to take this get response function and this call to use query, cut those out. Okay, that component's going to complain for a second, but that's fine. And then I'm going to take that over to queries, paste that in here. So here I have my function to make the request, and then instead here I've just created a custom hook. So what I'm going to do is I'll delete this piece and say const use JSON p call equals, and it's going to equal a function that returns the result of use query JSONP get response. Okay, and there we go. We've just made this into a custom hook. I just need to export this. So this way I don't have to write JSONP every time. I know I'm getting this, it's all relating to the same API call when I use this custom hook. So now this gets simplified into, so now I can, instead of importing use query, I just import use JSON p call. And now I just say const data is loading error refetch equals use JSON p call. And again, see, that's a bit cleaner because I didn't have to have all that function and all that stuff in there. Okay, expected assignment or function call instead of sign expression. I think this just needs to be refreshed. Oh, expected an assignment on line 3.1. Oh, this is just hanging out there. Okay, and see, it's working again, but our code is looking a lot cleaner. Now, wouldn't it be nice if I could simplify this? Okay, so see, like this code right here, I have to have all these if statements. Probably not a bad idea is we can create a function to handle that. So I'll create one real quick. We'll just put it in our queries file since it relates to our queries. So we'll say export const, we'll call it const render query. And it's going to be a function that takes in one argument, which we'll call JSX, because it takes in the JSX for a correct response. So then what I'll do is I will just literally copy this logic, just cut this right out. And actually it should take two arguments. It should take the response and the JSX. Okay. And then what we do is first thing we'll do is we'll destructure the JSX, or destructure the response, so const response. So let me just do this. Where was that? Request. So I'm actually just going to cut this piece out and replace that with response, const response. Okay. Put that in here and make that equal response. So that way it gets those variables from the response. The only difference is that it'll return, so this I'm going to cut here and make this JSX. It'll return JSX, because this thing is, these two are always going to be the same. Like, I'm always going to want to just return error, or just sort of the same kind of error message or loading regardless. Okay, so to save myself from having to type all this over and over again, I can abstract that to here. Okay, and then just do this instead. In request, we just return. So then I would also import render query from here. I would just return render query. I pass it the response object, and then pass it the JSX. Okay. Save. Expected. What does it not like about that? Maybe it just wants me to put this in a parenthesis. Okay. Oh. Okay, so then what I would have to do here in that case is actually make this a function that returns JSX. So the second argument would have to be a function that returns a JSX because I need to pass it the data. So it would be like this, which is fine. Okay. And then we would pass it this, and then we would have to declare data as a parameter. And I just need to go adjust this, that we pass, instead of its JSX as a function, and we pass in the data. Okay, and then let me just double check here how that is all looking. Actually, we'll do this. We'll pass it the response object. It gets passed the response, and then we can just structure what we need. So I can just be from here, just be like data refetch, and now we're back in business. Okay, well, see, this component has now gotten a lot smaller, and we've abstracted away a lot of that logic by creating that custom hook and that custom function. And yeah, so you see here, I can grab the API, and I can grab that API data in any component using this. And then now, as I use that as a response, I can just use render query, so I don't have to keep putting that sort of if loading, if error state in every component. All I have to do is just pass the response from the hook, and then pass it a function that renders what JSX I want if it's successful, and I'll just deconstruct that. So this is, again, ways that you can make your components a lot more quicker, a lot smaller, reduce the amount of code you're rewriting, and again, manage your state easier using React Query and React Recoil. Okay, so again, you could just use React Recoil and React Query without the custom hooks. The custom hooks definitely make life a lot easier. But yeah, that's hopefully this. And the great thing about when you construct the custom hooks yourself is that you can have that really custom error message. Like, I could create a library, but then you have to pass it like 3 callbacks, and then you're kind of missing the point. But you take a moment to create these custom hooks for your particular app, you'll save yourself a lot of time. And hopefully this kind of gave you like a pathway on how you can do that and use these libraries to really save time in passing app information around your app. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.